Welcome back to DMG's Bootstraps and Business. I'm Savannah Jones, and today we're speaking with industrial and organizational psychologist Jeff Johnson, who's been working with organizations in all industries, ranging in size from high-growth startups to some of the largest global organizations in the world to help them build their leadership teams. We'll also find out what it takes to be a leader and what to consider if you're ready to build your leadership team. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. We're going to get into leadership and leadership teams and what it takes to become a leader and build your leadership team. But first, let's discuss your title, an IO psychologist, and hear a little bit more about your background and experience.
You bet. Well, thanks for having me. So IO psychology stands for industrial and organizational psychology. And industrial and organizational psychology is the application of psychological principles, practice, and research to workplace challenges. So as you can imagine, companies are run by people. They rely on human beings. So the psychology of that human being or those human beings is crucial to understand and to leverage to really help organizations grow and leaders be successful. I am a blend of I and O. There are many practitioners out there who are particularly focused in one area. So they may be industrial psychologists, which tends to be much more in the analytics, data-driven realm of really helping guide organizations, whereas organizational psychology is more, team building, focusing on culture of organizations. Often, some would say, that more interpersonal, maybe even softer side, so to speak. And some of us are a blend. And I'm a bit of both and have had a career doing both, really having a foot in both ends of that spectrum.
So you worked with organizations that are global, and you've also worked with startups, all sizes, all industries. Give us a little bit more information about how you've collaborated with these companies and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, just to kind of start with what it looks like, they look very different. The work I do with organizations is completely customized, tailored. No two clients, no two organizations, their challenges and how to work with them have been the same. And I have worked with hundreds, and not one of those, or not two of those, I should say, have been identical or repeated. Some similarities and themes that we can talk about for sure, but they're all somewhat different. And I've worked with all industries and organizations in all different growth phases. And I'll be happy to talk a bit about some of those differences as organizations evolve. And I'm sure many have heard of this term, what got you here won't get you there necessarily. And that is a real thing. And it comes up in the work I do all the time around leadership, talent management, and so forth.
So what are some of the challenges that organizations are facing right now?
So broadly, there are quite a number, actually. So, broadly speaking, and it obviously it varies from size of organization to industry, where they are in their growth phase, particular challenges they are dealing with around profitability or lack of and so forth. But just to go really broad and in general is organizations still to this day are really struggling with understanding how to leverage talent or people in a strategic way, right? It's not just about, let me give you a simple example. Often there's concern about hiring efficiently, right? We want to keep costs down on hiring, but hiring the wrong person faster or cheaper doesn't necessarily help the organization or that team and what have you. So, and organizations are struggling with that right now. Well, how do we know? How do we make that difference? A lot of times they're turning to people who maybe ran companies in the past, who had success, but don't really know how to leverage that talent or how to build that strategic talent management infrastructure and framework. That is still a challenge for organizations of all sizes at a very broad level. Now, within that, which we could do a deeper dive in any area, there's continuous kind of misunderstanding, misapplication of science, and IO psychology is data-driven, evidence-based scientific practice. And needless to say, that's confusing to many who aren't in the field, right? Or the application of science of psychology to organizations is not the same necessarily as you might see in other applications of the scientific method. So there's a lot of confusion there, as you can imagine. And, and that's one of the things I really work with organizations to navigate through. You don't have to be an expert in psychology to really grasp the principles and the application for your company specifically.
Well, back to staffing and hiring the right person or more efficiently or spending time with the wrong person. Right now, we're not in the middle of the pandemic anymore. We're coming on to the backside of the pandemic, and there are staffing issues, labor issues. Companies are having a really difficult time where prior to they could possibly pick and choose. And so it's a little more difficult now. What are you seeing when you're talking to these organizations?
Yeah, good point. And yeah, the nature of work has changed. The dynamics, the socio-political changes, the economic changes definitely impact organizations. So the work I do as an IO psychologist does tend to go from the inside of the organization. But to your point, all organizations are embedded in the system, right? And those system dynamics do change. And absolutely, you're calling one out that is top of mind. Right now, not new. There have been retention challenges in all industries at some point or another. Kind of depends on what that topic is. It could be an oversupply of labor in a particular area and what have you. So right now, organizations are challenged with getting that talent. And like I was mentioning earlier, hiring the right person. When I say the right person, it's really the best fit for that individual as much as it is for the organization as they look for what are those skills, abilities, preferences that we are looking for in an individual. And often organizations make the mistake of, well, let's see what a resume says. Let's look at their quote unquote experience, and that will give us all we need. Or even worse yet, let's really rely on references, thank you, friend, right? And so they're working with really often unreliable or even irrelevant data in order to make that hiring decision. Now, that is very relevant in this context. It's relevant in every context, but particularly right now, as you're looking to not only hire the best, but retain them, right? Get them to show up. So that is part of that screening process. Are they really a good fit? So that's on the selection side. There's much more to that as you think about incentives, right? And I know often the default is pay them more money, right? That's how you get them to show up. That is relevant, but rarely is that the full solution. It's very much about the work environment, the culture of the organization, the climate in which they work, the leader. There is a true saying, most people don't quit their jobs, they quit the manager or their leader, right? So they're among other factors. So organizations I'm working with that are looking into that, and there are some, and they've had shortages actually, particularly in engineering for years. So this is an ongoing challenge, are looking at those different levers. So as you think about, okay, how do we not only hire the best, but then retain and grow our organization in the way we want it to go? It's to look at, okay, what are all the levers we can pull? You don't necessarily pull them all, right? You prioritize to get the biggest bang for the buck, but it's first to identify what are those levers that we can use.
So before we jump into how you've worked with some of the leaders to overcome some of these challenges, let's talk about the remote world. You've worked remotely for basically your entire career, over 20 years. So this isn't new to you, but this is very new to organizations and individuals. I come in here to record in the studio because I have to be here physically. Otherwise, I'm working at home, which I've never done in my entire career.
Right. So you're right. Most of my career has been remote, not 100%. I actually was internal, even though my career path has been a combination of remote, external consultant or consulting. I did have a 3.5-year stint where I was internal in a large healthcare system, which did require my physical presence, like everybody else, commuting and such. But yeah, absolutely. It is an interesting dynamic. And again, IO psychology comes into play with all of that. So here, let's just kind of walk through as people might be thinking about, how do I hire remotely? How do I motivate them? How do I even know what they're doing? There are some organizations that are attempting to track ongoing day-to-day behavior. There are some of those, not to be named, but some software programs that are, monitoring every move or the time spent doing this and that. And these are probably mistakes. And here's why I say that is, as you think about the remote nature of work, then, okay, well, maybe we should hire to those skills, or maybe it's not even a skill. It could even be a preference or propensity to work effectively on their own, for example, or not being monitored, or not either valuing that in-person need to have face-to-face time as much, or maybe taking initiative more so than others. So in other words, you would want to look to, as we talk about the job that is now remote, what's changed? What are the preferences, attributes, et cetera, that would be very useful or more likely, nothing's ever perfect, but more likely for that person to thrive in that type of environment, to really produce. And in some cases, you might even have remote workers that produce more remote than they would have in an office with a bunch of distractions or people around them and whatever. So that's one thing to think about. The other is performance measurement. I can't emphasize this enough, and this has come up a lot over the last, even pre-pandemic, but definitely during the pandemic, is, well, how do I know what they're doing? Well, those employees that report to me, particularly as you think about not even being in the same city or state, right? I work with organizations that there are managers that have not ever met their direct reports in person years later, yet have had tremendous productivity, innovation, and engagement for years. So that can be done, and that can be new to some people. Okay, well, how do I do that? Well, devil's in the details. There are many different elements to that beyond just the hiring, measuring performance, ensuring as a leader you are engaged, or determining what kind of engagement or interaction is going to be most useful for this person. Let me give you an example. Somebody who's very new remote may benefit from a lot more interaction from their direct manager, right? A lot more guidance, maybe even directives, right? That could be, depending on the job, over time, much better to leave that person to their own devices. Allow them just, you do it at your own time, as long as we get the outcomes that we desire. So it changes, and that's part of the magic and the trick to leadership, the art and science, right? It's not just formulaic, but it can shift, and that would be an example of that in the remote setting.
So they are facing a lot of challenges. What's your first step when you walk into a startup or an organization and they're coming to you with questions about leadership team? What's that first step look like?
Yeah. The most important thing to start with really is, what is the organization's mission, vision, values, strategic intent, or strategic goals? What are they looking to accomplish, right? What is that direction they want to head? And the reason why that's so important is, like I mentioned earlier, talent management is not there's not a one size fits all. The psychological principles as applied vary depending on what is needed. And so if you think about a talent strategy, it's, well, what should we do in terms of hiring? What kind of people do we need? What kind of skills are going to come to bear? What kind of culture, climate, and so forth do we want to build? Well, that depends on your strategy, your strategic intent, the direction you want the organization to go. So we really have to start there. I have worked with organizations where that's unclear. That's a little mushy, right? That can happen, and I can imagine with some small startups or fairly new organizations, or even organizations that are in flux. Maybe there has been a a strategic shift. That can happen as well. I really encourage bringing that clarity as best you can. Doesn't always happen. If we lack that clarity in the moment, there's still some things we can do. So in other words, the talent strategy may not map exactly or directly or, even more so into their strategy if they're unclear, but at least more generally, right? So they may say, well, we know regardless of, here's a simple example. Regardless of our strategic intent, we know we need to do better around hiring salespeople that can produce to whatever level. Okay, so we could do that much at least, right? So we don't have to necessarily wait on that. We know that's going to help no matter what. But that's not true with other strategic directions an organization might be headed. Well, now we don't want to just, what is that? Instead of ready, shoot, aim, fire, whatever, it's just fire and then aim later, And I encourage that, because organizations, I want them to have a good experience with the strategic talent management approach. Because if organizations I have heard from, I've been lucky, I haven't come across this directly, but indirectly they've said, we worked with, somebody, in organizational development, or they were an advisor of some sort on our talent strategy. No idea what their background is, but it didn't make sense. It didn't map in. And then they say it's all fluff, right? That's just fluff. It's magic. You can't predict human behavior. You can't, control people, and you can't get them to innovate. You can't get them to get, that, which is all false, by the way. But that's the feel they have if you miss the mark. So I walk a fine line of, I really want to make sure that we hit the mark. And if we can't, because the mark isn't clear, let's at least get into the, somewhere on the board, so to speak.
Well, you brought up innovation. How can leaders most effectively foster innovation with their team and in their organizations?
Yeah, and that's a big one, as you can imagine nowadays, right? The United States for quite some time now has moved more and more away from a manufacturing model. By the way, IO psychology applies to manufacturing as well, but has moved more toward a customer orientation, innovation, new technologies. Being on the front end, leading the world in new directions for tech and applications. So this is a big deal, and it's a big deal really arguably in every organization, even some of the more established that you would think, well, let me just, a grocery store, really how much innovation really happens there, you'd be surprised at how much can and does happen to enhance efficiencies and so forth. So back to what's really helpful there, one is, to really grow that, we have to determine why. It's kind of back to what we were just talking about. When we say innovation, what does that mean? Innovation in what way? And often we talk about that as a competency. So a lot of the work I do is around leadership competencies. So helping leaders either innovate, but usually it's not them innovating, it's them identifying or who can innovate and or differently would be promoting innovation. How do you build a culture of innovation? So, and that's an important one because think of the two different kinds of organizations. One where if you're wrong, you're penalized. If you try something new, if you take any risks, right, that's not seen as good. I actually worked with an organization quite some years ago that was very non-innovative. They actually penalized people for even trying without even knowing whether it would work or not. The fact you stepped out of the box at all. So you can imagine there was zero innovation there. I currently work with quite a number of organizations that not only do they promote innovation, that thinking, they reward failure. They actually look and say the thinking and the reasoning, the risk you took there was calculated and rational. It wasn't frivolous and ridiculous. I know there's gray area in there, but the fact that you're thinking along those lines, we reward for that. And in fact, they even build it into their, leadership competencies. You'll even see them in job descriptions, so to speak, where, that innovative mindset, skill set, and hopefully applying that is rewarded, right? So that's a big piece. So hiring to that, and you can do that. I work with organizations to help them identify who is more likely to be creative. It's partly an attribute, a mindset, so to speak, and a skill, right? Creative and innovative, but also who's bold and courageous enough to apply that, to push against the status quo, try something new, and then measure that and reward to that is very helpful.
So we're talking about leadership. Is there a difference between leadership and management?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, definitely. So as you think about, they overlap, and management, being a manager or management is administrative and focused, right? So think of all those admin pieces of running an organization that have to happen, right? The nuts and bolts, those procedures, those norms, even think of even just the, HR procedures and hiring and so forth. All of this is baseline and it has to happen. And in the research and application of IO psychology, management behaviors are baseline. They are enough to help an organization simply function in that day, in that moment, right? To minimize litigation risk, for example, or to minimize, injury or other problems. It's about avoiding something going haywire, so to speak, right? Leadership is very different. So management doesn't really get you here. Leadership is focused on kind of what we were just talking about. How do you motivate others? How do you incentivize? How do you share that vision? How do you build a culture of innovation, engagement, trust? How do you build a culture of trust, right? So we collaborate together. Management doesn't do that. Leadership does. So leading is, though integrated with management, is differentiated in that way. Here's another way of thinking about it. Management will often, or manager behaviors will get an organization to survive. Leadership will get organizations to thrive, to win in the market, not just lag and survive in the market. That's kind of another way of thinking about it. And again, as a reminder, this is all, when I say these things, this isn't just my opinion. This is all heavily decades and decades of research, heavily researched through application of psychology to organizations and leadership. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, what advice would you share with someone who is looking to become a leader and or is a leader and wants to grow?
Yeah. I do work with quite a number of, in the work I do work with leaders at all levels, right? So executives running the companies, C-level, Fortune 1000s. So at the pinnacle of their career, and in fact, even heading toward probably opting out of their career, all the way through middle level leaders. And then, yes, to those that are just getting started. And, in your career path, there are some things that, to get going that, are going to be helpful to get going. And then some things that you're going to want to keep applying for forever. So I'm going to start with probably what would be helpful to even just get going. And that is to really think about, introspect, right? So we call it looking inward, right? And saying, well, who am I, as a person? What motivates me? Where will I thrive? And if the answer is I don't know, and that's okay, then do some exploration to find out, right? Try things out, talk to people, build even mentoring relationships to do that exploration. But it's also looking outward. So as you identify, say, I know who I am, and here's what I value, and these are the attributes I possess, so to speak. And I want to work in, like for example, I really want to work with people or in an environment where I'm interacting with human beings. Okay, well, at least then that's a start. So you would then look outward to say, okay, what would that look like? Whether you're starting your own company, getting involved with a different company, applying for a job, whatever it is, really look for something that fits for you, not just what is going to pay the bills today, right? That's kind of going to lead to a short-term benefit, but probably a long-term dead end. But another key piece of that, and this is something, so that's often early on, right? And then we kind of usually know where we are with that. But it's who it's building that network, and that is forever. That is forever. I'm working with, again, senior executives running companies. We're talking about building what we call a stakeholder map. These are people who are very well connected. The problem isn't they don't know people, it's that they've lost track. We build a stakeholder map, and they start to say, well, yeah, geez, I really should be touching base with those other executives here in this Fortune 500 massive organization, even though I don't interact with them on a daily basis, for example. Or all the way back to your question on maybe early on, hey, we want to get started, absolutely crucial. So I would encourage people to create a systematic way of tracking, okay, who are my connections? Why am I connecting with this person? What do I want them to know about me? How do I want to build my brand, right? What would be helpful as I pursue whatever it is going forward? So building those connections. So it's not just who you know, but how they know you, right? So it's a two-way street. So that'd be another piece. And another element here, and again, this goes on forever, and that is to take on the mindset of continuous quality improvement of yourself, continuous learner. So looking at those leadership competencies, where are you today? And you're never, ever finished. I've only heard that from one individual who was an early kind of an up-and-coming leader who said, I know it all. I'm there. There's really, which is a funny statement. I've only heard it once out of thousands of leaders. And through the conversations, as I was working with him one-on-one as an executive coach, he began to realize, oh my gosh, the more he looked into it, the more he realized it's kind of like the more you know what you don't know. And so taking that mindset of there's always more to improve on. Don't just improve on anything willy-nilly, rather focus on what's going to identify what's going to really help me get to that level or build my company. Let me give you a simple example. Communication, very common. Right, very common challenge, or it's close cousin communicativeness. So, for many, communication is not a strength, right? Or they think, well, no, I'm a great presenter, or if I'm talking to somebody, I have an outline, I'm pretty clear. But do you initiate communication? That's communicativeness enough, right? And so it's partly a mindset as well as a skill set. So look to those. I would advise that look for those leadership areas and develop those in any way, shape, or form you can, whether that's through workshops. And by the way, this is anybody. This is, again, not just early stage leaders or, you're the up and coming leader and you're just now creating a startup. You'll be doing this, hopefully, as you're an executive running a Fortune 1000. It wouldn't matter. But looking to continue to build those skills, as there is never an end to it, but rather just a different focus depending on what's needed given the dynamics in your organization and your career path.
Well, that deals with the individual and them starting to break into leadership roles or expand leadership roles. So let's just touch before we close this out on building a leadership team. If you're an organization right now and you don't have one, but you're at a place where you have management and you have staff, it's time for a leadership team. What are the steps you take there?
Yeah. So Again, kind of backing up to an earlier question, you will always want to go back to the mission, vision, values, the overarching strategy of the organization, because the answer to that question is going to depend on those factors. So, for example, what do we need? Do we need a chief operating officer? Probably, or somebody, whether it's that title or not, at least, does that. But do we need a chief marketing officer type of individual, or strategy officer, or product officer? Whatever. So it all starts with what's the structure of our organization? What do we really need? So that's first. And that's, kind of a no-brainer. I think most people know that. The key is being diligent about that, and probably, trying to get multiple perspectives to come to that determination. But once you're there, then so that's on the structural side, right? What's needed. Then on the individual side, right? It's okay, well, what do we mean by leadership? When I say I'm going to hire a leadership team.
Right.
Right. What am I talking about? So back to your point earlier about manager versus leader. And oftentimes people, that gets a little mushed up, and they think, well, we need again, bear with me on these examples, but, we need a CFO or a finance lead. Well, they better know, finance. They better know, let's see here, do they know even accounting? Do they, those are management attributes, right? Those aren't actually leadership attributes, arguably. So it's really more about, okay, how are they going to motivate others? Will they know how to build their team? Right? Will they help us build a sustainable culture of high performance, trust, collaboration, or whatever? See, again, depends on, what you're needing. So then those are the attributes you want to be looking for as, you're building that team around you, or your team is expanding, maybe adding more team members. It comes back to what is needed. We call that in our field leadership competency modeling. Not a big deal. It can sound like, oh my gosh, what the heck is that? Pretty straightforward. It's just identifying what are the attributes, skills, abilities, and preferences, et cetera, of leaders who would help us execute on our strategic priorities. That's really all it comes down to. And you can do that on your own, get a little help from an outside person. I've been that outside person. I often work with organizations to help them figure out how to do that on their own. The point is to find that target, because once you do that, then it comes down to how do we find that person, right, or those people? And how do we know that they really are? So if I want attributes or skills A, B, and C, somebody comes walking in that door and, wow, look at the resume, it looks like A, B, and C. Maybe a recruiter has sent that person your way, or a friend or something. Wow, on paper it looks like A, B, and C, and they're friends, or let's call them references, interchangeable. A, B, and C is, oh wow, he seems to. I go on LinkedIn, they seem to have that. That all means usually almost nothing in leadership. That means a lot in management. Oh, they have an MBA. But when it comes to leadership, that's almost all irrelevant. We really have to go a step further. And that's the crux of a lot of the work I do, is working with organizations to help them make those decisions around, okay, what are those attributes? They say they have them, but how do we know they really have them? How do I really know those personality attributes, potential risk factors, values and motivators, skills, even cognitive capacity to navigate complexity and make decisions in a dynamic environment? How do I know? Because somebody says that? That's like somebody telling you, I'm really smart. Okay.
Well, I said so.
Right. Or your friends do, or an ex-coworker or something like that. And so we really want to be diligent. And that's because as you think about it, for whether it's a startup, and in fact, smaller companies that are in startup mode or early phase mode or small caps, those hiring decisions will make or break their company often. It is not to say the big Fortune 500s aren't diligent or shouldn't be, but it's in some ways even more important. You really got to make sure that hiring decision is made, correctly. When I say correctly, it's never perfect, but as best as you can get it, reasonably. So we want to assess for those attributes. And again, that's a lot of the work I do, is leveraging these standardized assessments that tap into, in a reliable and really a very difficult way to game. Okay, you can't really game these, but anyway, in a reliable, valid way, what are those attributes that this person now possesses? Right? Do those attributes, skills, etc., map into what's needed? There's that. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, and how much overlap is there of what's needed and what this person or these different candidates have? Now, again, measurement is everything. So how are we assessing or measuring those? And I work with organizations, again, I either do it or I work with them. I often partner with organizations to create, for example, business case scenarios, role plays. Let's have them do it. It's one thing to say, here's what I do. Now let's have you do it. that's a common, I think these are.
That sounds frightening.
It is very frightening. I know I've actually been on the other end of that in an interview, and believe me, I realize I terrorize people. But it turns out to that point, though, honestly, too, that because there is fear of that. That's a real thing. I think less nowadays, and that is, what if there's too much rigor? What if we put candidates through too much assessment? The interviews are really structured. Highly structured interviews are intimidating. I mean, they make you sweat, right? Or have them do the actual thing. You say you're great at presenting, you're going to do it right now in front of all of us, Right? Okay, so does that turn people off? It turns out it does turn some people off. It turns, and they've researched this thoroughly for decades, the low performers are turned off. And so it's a great way to screen them out. If you say, here is what we go through, and they're saying, well, I don't really want to do all that. You don't want them in general. You really don't. Either low performer or they're just not that motivated. Or they're just kicking tires. I mean, they're looking for other things. So it's actually another screen by having a rigorous process. So on the flip side, they have found that actually impresses candidates more. Even candidates who did not get hired, but were interviewed or followed up with, were very impressed with the organization that was more thorough in their assessment and selection process, with the idea being that they're saying, well, I'd love to work there because they're only hiring the best, so to speak, right? So that's something for new leaders or even incumbent leaders to keep in mind, that if they feel like it's too much. Now, is there a limit on how much to assess? Absolutely. There's diminishing returns, and I work with organizations to help them kind of determine, okay, how do we get the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak? It's not always for dollars. It can just be time and other resources. But how do we get the most out of this particular assessment or selection process? And again, there's no right or wrong. It's kind of there's a little bit of an art to that kind of nuance of, when is enough enough? And again, we don't want to do too much. I mean, you can imagine, I don't think anybody does this, but if it was a ridiculous amount, you might start to turn off everyone, right? But I have not come across that.
Well, is there anything you want to leave us with in regards to team building, leadership building within an individual or an organization, something that maybe I didn't question you about or we didn't touch on that would be really beneficial today?
Yeah, there's a lot to this. So it is there are a few things I will leave.
Right. It is a lot. It is a lot, but it matters.
It does. It's funny too. People talk about my, what I do, and when they first hear it, they say, well, that's a real specialization, right? Really specialized. And it turns out it's the exact opposite of that. There are people that spend their entire careers not doing anything I do and vice versa. So in IO, so it's a very broad, it's a broad topic, but basically, a few things, and I'm in no particular order of importance, but I would encourage leaders to think about for their own development. I kind of mentioned this earlier, is the interaction of and the importance of mindset, skill set, and tool set. The mindset of leadership, building that confidence, having that mental orientation toward, that vision, whatever that vision is you have for yourself. So keeping that mindset, because it can, sometimes fade. Skill set, we already talked about that. Many different leadership skills or competencies to build and continue to develop those. And then tool set is used kind of loosely as resources, and that's back to who do you know, right? But also leveraging tools in leadership, as you grow your leadership skills and capabilities, it's not all on you. There are many tools and other ways to facilitate or magnify your leadership impact that people can find and leverage out there. So it's nothing new. Another thing that I think leaders, this can kind of trip leaders up, and this happens a lot from really, almost ironically, from very high performer, very intelligent, maybe very successful in school and so forth, leaders where there's this perfectionism orientation, so to speak. There's this, I've got to get it done right. Or, well, if you can't do it, on a 1 to 10 to at least a 9, why do it? And I come across this a lot, and here's what I would recommend that leaders do. And that is, forget about perfectionism. There is no room for perfectionism in leadership. And in fact, it's counterproductive. You need, as a leader, to make mistakes. I often tell leaders, if you aren't failing somewhere, if you're not making mistakes, you're not leading. If you think you're doing it all right, oh, that was great, did it all right, you missed something. Either you didn't do it right or you're not doing what you could do. So there should be that, at some level, risk-taking, at some level of failure. Also, as you can probably, tell from the kind of work we do, there's some mushiness in there, right? It's not perfect. These people aren't widgets. I know everybody knows that, but that has implications around everything from measurement error and assessments to not perfect performance measurement. Okay, the culture isn't going to be 100% the culture we always wanted, but it's close enough. As a leader, so important to say good enough. And in fact, there are some areas of leadership, depending on the strategy, the vision, the mission, and so forth, where we need to be really, really good. We need to be A players at this as a leader. You know what? On this other attribute here, yeah, that's okay. Mediocre's okay. Mediocre's okay. Let's let it go. And that's a tough trade-off for people who are highly capable, skilled, had a lot of success in their past, very motivated, talented, or not, but just that orientation of I got to do it all well. And the answer is not only do you not need to do it all well, you need to actually not do some things well and do the right things well.
Well, that's a good take. A lot of perfectionists will be happy to hear that today.
Believe me,
let it go.
I struggle with, I work with a lot of executives one-on-one in what we call leadership coaching. And that is one of those things that it's tough to talk them off the cliff, so to speak. I don't know if I make a lot of progress sometimes. It's just so ingrained in people. And then often they need others around them who can help stop them and say, that's okay. Even though I know you think it needs to be go to the next level, you're good there. So that's that network, right? That network support. And that'd be the last thing. I'll leave with one last thing is whatever it is you do, even if, whether you're starting a startup, right? You're founding it, or you're coming on board, or you're in a small cap, or you decide to go internal at a mid cap or a Fortune 1000. Or you decide, I don't want to be in this leadership role. I want to be an individual contributor, right? You can still lead. Leadership does not require a title, right? So it's still being an influencer, still having an impact, still pursuing those leadership capabilities, if you will, that will make a difference in your career, in the work you do, the organization you're in, or the people you work with. So that would be one other piece.
Well, that's a lot of great information for individuals who are in leadership roles now, people who want to step into leadership roles, and for organizations who are either thinking about building a leadership team or have one, and they're trying to fine tune. So a lot of great information. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Hey, well, thank you for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you, as always, for checking out DMG's Bootstraps and Business. If you'd like to find out more about our guests, DMG, or these podcasts, just check out the show notes. Thank you.